With the release of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I have made the best efforts possible to practically no-life this game. I do the chores that need to be done to keep life on track, and then it's down to stabbing, climbing, talking, and burning. No social activities to speak of at this time, because
there's a fucking pandemic!
Throughout the time I have spent with Valhalla, I have to say, overall, it's a decent game. It makes commendable efforts to reinvent the formula, and there is a huge, almost beyond reasonable amount of content to discover. Is it a 10 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10? No. I know we've long established that review scores are BS and we don't really take them seriously anymore, but seriously, people, hold up. Whilst this is technically a review of Valhalla, I do also hope to do a good enough job at summarising the current situation Ubisoft find themselves in, and hope to provide enough insight that can help us point this franchise in the right direction for the near future. So, with that out of the way, I want to break down the three main factors that this game revolves around and dissect the Assassin's Creed problems, or the ACPs. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, you begin your first few hours in Norway that attempts to familiarise you with the characters you'll be spending the most time with, like the protagonist Eivor, his brother Sigurd, and his wife Randvi, and others of course. After completing the opening chapter, there begins a conflict within the family on who holds the power in the region. Eventually one thing leads to another, and we eventually bark our own separate ways and set sail for England. The narrative of Valhalla's story simply boils down to building alliances within other clans and kingdoms across England, whilst also balancing it with your relationship with your brother. After maintaining your settlement, which acts as this sort of social hub where you can build your structures like tattoo shops, a merchant shop, homes for your fellow Vikings, a recruitment station, and there's a few side quests to do, and also some romance options.
Come over here.
Right? And that dude is pumping, and she's screaming, and he's still pumping, and she's screaming, and then they orgasm together. Ah!
It's also where you keep your alliance map, where you make a pledge to gain an alliance within that region to build up your forces around the country. Now, the process of completing one of these story arcs goes something like this. You meet up with the main characters from that region, you do them a favour so you can earn their trust, you spend the next couple of hours building up their forces, whether it be saving prisoners, cleaning out enemy positions, and then you finish it off with a pretty epic siege battle. All this process takes around 4 to 6 hours if you just commit to those missions. Now, here's when the ACPs start to creep in a little. You complete one of these arcs, and then you go back to your settlement and make another pledge in another region. 6 hours later, you've done that one, then you come back and make another pledge, and then another. And another, and another. This is a typical ACP that has haunted, to be brutally honest, most of the main entries. Say you have a 40-hour story. The first 10 hours is introducing you to the characters, it sets up the main plot, the villains, the world, and then the next 20 is borderline filler that hardly pushes the plot forward and drains you of motivation to drag you on. And then the final act of it resurrects the original narrative from the first 10 hours, and then you close the book. Valhalla's story feels more like a TV show. The alliance missions are the episodes, but unlike games that have used this format effectively, there is no connection whatsoever to each passing alliance or the story arc involving Sigurd. And I actually liked a handful of these mini-stories. I happen to actually like some of the characters we met along the way, but not necessarily because they were interesting. It was more of just the fact that they were your only source of information in each of these regions. So you just grow accustomed to them, and after a while you just make a subconscious decision on whether they're cool or not. And it didn't help that the dialogue and the delivery of some of the lines from time to time made me retreat behind my chair in fear.
Let fall the arrow storm. The battle begins.
Ah, you never said this one was a poet.
I need to piss.
And every now and then throughout this conquest, the story arc involving your brother is painfully spoon-fed to you in tiny little slices that are scattered throughout the entire story, and each time it left me hanging in such disarray the longer the story went on. Now, this is what my alliance map looks like 25 hours in. Now granted, I didn't dedicate all of that time to just spending it on the story missions, but Jesus in heaven, I'd be willing to make a bold statement right now to say it's probably going to take me about 60 hours minimum to finish it up. Now, I don't want to give developers any funny ideas that I'm campaigning for less content in games, because that's dangerous. I'm happy that there's so much stuff here jam-packed into this game, and Ubisoft, to be honest, deserves some credit and applause for providing us with this amount. But with a cold heart, I had to tell myself that the content that is here doesn't have me invested at the level to where 60 hours of commitment isn't justifiable, even if the payoff in the end is worth it. Now, once the plot loop of these story arcs become predictable, you will have worked out by the opening cutscene on how things are going to go. Hey there, you must be the guy I'm teaming up with, and you must be the one I'm killing. Yeah? Yeah, I thought as much. Assassin's Creed Valhalla's gameplay follows most of the footprints imprinted by Origins and Odyssey. The parkour system is pretty solid, with the occasional annoyance that you know from previous games. Now, combat from the beginning did feel really cheap and poorly executed, but as you progress you do start learning these new movesets and get new weapons and these new abilities that can be performed with a full bar of adrenaline, alongside the very gruesome finishers which never get old. Now, these abilities are easily the biggest shake-up to the combat system, and whilst they are undeniably satisfying to perform, unlike certain other games that use combat systems in this way, they don't end up blending in very well with the flow of the entire system. So, you'll be in a scuffle, practically button mashing your way through, and then you activate one of these abilities, but then you go straight back to spamming light attacks. So there's no sort of blend or combination that the player can perform that keeps the combat feeling fresh. During most of these sections, I did my best to vary up my own gameplay to make it enjoyable. I'd kill a few the standard way, and then I'd use an ability for a few, and then I'd force myself to do like a couple of parries or fall back a little and use my bow and arrow, even if there was no reason to and I felt like I was just wasting time. I don't think I'd have so much of a problem though with the system if it felt just a little bit more responsive and frankly more satisfying. A few examples could be the lock-on mechanic. Often the game will auto-lock onto a player that you didn't want it to. Fighting indoors, the camera immediately turns on you. And in terms of the basic movesets, they just don't have a whole lot of depth to them. Whether it's a two-handed weapon, a one-hand and a shield, or dual-wielding, or even two shields for that matter. As for larger battles, your AI companions are just... they're every combination of bad into one. And after experiencing them, I felt so stupid for not paying attention to the literature. Now, the combat isn't downright terrible. Everything that is needed to make a solid combat system is present in this game, but it's just not quite there yet in terms of responsiveness and smoothness. Now, of course, we do have our stealth. We have it, but that's not saying much. The stealth aspect has been practically suppressed to the extent to where there is almost no reason to go in quietly, because melee combat just gets things done so much quicker. And if you happen to make the wrong decisions on your upgrade points, worst case scenario, if you don't spend some skill points on upgrading your assassination damage, you will not be able to one-hit kill the most basic enemies when performing stealth. Now, by accident, I luckily spent my points wisely and I had a few goes at stealth. And it's alright. I managed to get the achievement to where you kill 10 enemies without being spotted, but once I realised that melees were just an easy way to cheese the sections without having any kind of challenge, I just felt like I was wasting time. This part here kind of summed it all up for me. There's a part in the story where you get the choice to either stealth or go full balls to the walls in a cottage raid, basically. I don't know what came over me, but I thought, whatever, I'll just go in and give it a shot. No more than 1 minute later, some guard turned to me and said, "You're really inconsistent at uploading videos." So I started swinging. Couple this with the fact that not all guards in the area will be aware of your presence once you get spotted, even in the case of civilians running all over the place in terror, and I have set fire to a few cottages already, but they just didn't know. They were just up here chilling, like they didn't know anything. So the element of risk is practically non-existent. Those cocktail of emotions I'm supposed to feel when I'm behind enemy lines and outnumbered severely, that's completely absent in Valhalla. What started to hit home with me was that there's actually a bug in the game that occurs quite frequently where I'll be performing stealth and the prompt to assassinate a target will pop up and I'll press it but the game for some reason registers a light attack blowing my cover. So I think perhaps even the game agrees with me. The open world of England in Assassin's Creed Valhalla is, like I mentioned before, connected by a number of regions that, like in previous games, all have different recommended power levels. Now, they've done away this time with the randomized stats that you'd get on your loot when you leveled up, which I actually welcome with open arms. I actually feel like I'm being given the freedom to customize my gear to the degree that I want to, rather than the game openly telling me to use a certain weapon because it does way more damage than the rest. With the help of the blacksmith, you can constantly upgrade certain gear pieces that you want to keep using, and you can go from having it being just a neutral piece to a legendary piece. And also, I appreciate that the loot system this time around is not an avalanche of stuff that you earn throughout the game that you will end up scrapping once it becomes completely insignificant. Your power level this time around is determined by a skill tree. You get 2 points each time you level up, and the way it works is that the skill tree is split into 3 categories: ranged, melee, and stealth, and you have to go down this streamlined path of nodes that do nothing but increase your stats by no more than 5%, until about 5 or 6 times you will reach an actual upgrade, like a new moveset or perk. It sounds really tedious, and admittedly it is, going through each section just spending these meaningless points on things that are just slightly making your stats a bit higher. You don't feel any different when you've done it. But the worst part of it is, you can't really plan out your route on where you want to spend your points, because each new section of upgrades is obscured to you until you reach it. So I would strongly advise you to look up a guide so that you can get an idea of where you want to spend your points, because there are some really cool abilities near the latter half of the game and you won't want to miss out on them. Now, the discoveries in each region that you will encounter are varied into 3: wealth, mysteries, and artifacts. The wealth is the loot, and it's definitely still got that exciting feel to it. Now, there are some that are held onto by NPCs, which you just basically kill and loot, and then there's others that are just out in the open. And then there's other ones, like small puzzle sections, which are so f***ing dumb. They are not so much hard to do, they're just plain out annoying. Like the ones that involve finding a key. So the game does tell you where the key is with a simple scan, but in order to get to these chests, 9 times out of 10, you've already had to surpass some form of challenge before, like finding the secret entry or cleaning out a section of guards, only then for the game to tell you that you've got to find a key. Now logically you would just say, well, why don't you just scan before you go in just to be sure? Well, the scanner only picks up between, I think, 50 or 75 meter radius within your position. And if the key's a little further away, you won't pick it up and you'll be under the impression that there is none. So that side of it I didn't like. Does anyone else imitate that chant every time it plays, or is it just me? But the best part of this whole new game are hands down the raids. This is by far the freshest thing that the franchise has introduced since probably the naval combat. And it was that one piece of essence that really made me feel like a Viking. Whilst it doesn't play out initially as we expected.
Crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentation of their women.
It still brings atmosphere and intensity. The only real negative I have to say about it is the constant frame drops. I played on the original Xbox One, which only runs at about 30 FPS and between 700 to 900p, and especially in the bigger set piece raids that are part of the story, they felt like slideshows at brief moments. And whilst admittedly most of them just end up feeling the same, they just didn't get old to me. The process of landing ashore, blowing your horn, and having the civilians of these towns running around in fear, it was just hands down the best part of this new game.
Fucking get up, steal, guys! Get up there! Hold the line! Hold the line! Fucking come and get it, man! Come on, you want it, steal from the back! No, Frederick! Frederick scored in your next, you can!
So Assassin's Creed Valhalla is decent, and that's really all I have to say about it. If you like the previous 2 games, then there's a pretty good chance that you'll like this game. But it is by no means, in my eyes, a home run. Now this is a little off topic, but trust me, I'll come back full circle in a sec. I recently had a conversation with a friend about the recent trends that have been surrounding the gaming industry, like exclusivity deals, add-ons, lack of originality, and other parts too. Coming away from that, I was quite quickly reminded of what Martin Scorsese said about the Marvel movies. He practically said Marvel movies aren't technically regarded to him as true cinema because their development is influenced by demand for more by the fans rather than the freedom of creativity. Now, I take that same attitude towards games, and when I think about games that are all about demand, I think about Call of Duty, FIFA, Madden, games that just come out every year and they never desire to evolve and they end up just being the best example of the definition of insanity. Assassin's Creed is really balancing on a thin line to what category it belongs in. It's been releasing new games most years since its inception, and it does very little different each time. Now, Origins was definitely a shake-up to the formula, but we're now on the third game of this, I'll call it, new age of Assassin's Creed games, and it's starting to lose its element of surprise. So say the next game is in ancient Japan, I would want them to put a big emphasis on feeling like a samurai soldier with a more redefined combat system that fits the concept, getting us in the deep end with this character confliction and humility one warrior must have to fight with honor. I'll just remove the patriotism here, and what I'm basically saying in plain English is just take notes from Ghost of Tsushima and roll with that. If Assassin's Creed wants to retain that impact it had on players back on the last generation, they're going to need to address the ACPs we've covered throughout this Valhalla review, accompanied by a redefined approach to certain aspects of gameplay that opens the door for new possibilities. Or, maybe they'll just continue playing it safe, retain this current formula, dress it up a little, and we get another new game that's just good. It's not stunning, it's not breathtaking, it's decent. And I personally wouldn't want to have that impression going into a new release for a franchise that I know was capable of being Game of the Year material not so long ago. Ubisoft, whenever and whatever the next time is, please don't just be alright, be excellent.